Imagine yourself standing in the middle of a chaotic battlefield, your heart pounding so loudly it drowns out the screams and gunfire. The ground beneath you shakes as Spanish cavalry charges through the haze, their steel armor glinting like fire in the smoke-filled air. The harsh smell of gunpowder burns your nose, and everywhere you turn, there's movement. Arrows flying, blades clashing, and warriors falling. And then you see him, a warrior unlike any other, charging straight into the heart of the fight. He doesn't seem real. Where his hands should be, there are blades, bound tightly to the stumps of his arms. He moves like a force of nature. Every swing of his arms and every step forward defy the odds stacked against him. He fights with nothing to lose, a fury that makes the Spanish soldiers hesitate, even with their steel swords and muskets. Around him, the Mapuche warriors fight just as fiercely, using their knowledge of the land to hold their ground against a relentless enemy. But it's this man, this warrior with no hands, who draws your attention. He isn't just fighting, he's proving something. That no amount of cruelty, no weapon, and no army can break the will of someone who refuses to surrender. This is the story of Galvarino, the warrior who turned his pain into power and became a legend of resistance. Southern Chile in the early 1500s was a land of dense forests, winding rivers, and snow-capped mountains. For the Mapuche, this land wasn't just a home, it was their lifeblood, shaping every part of their identity. They were farmers, warriors, and artisans, living in small, self-sufficient communities. Leadership was decentralized, with each community governed by a lonco, or chief, who consulted elders and warriors before making decisions. This autonomy made them adaptable, but it also meant that alliances and unity were fragile, something the Spanish would later try to exploit. The Mapuche valued their independence fiercely. Unlike the Inca Empire to the north, which organized under a single ruler, the Mapuche weren't interested in centralized power. Their focus was on defending their homes and preserving their way of life. They believed in reciprocity, honoring the land and its spirits in exchange for its bounty. This relationship with their environment was more than spiritual, it was practical. The Mapuche thrived because they understood how to work with the land, growing crops like maize and potatoes and raising llamas for food and wool. This balance, however, was disrupted when Spanish forces, led by Pedro de Valdivia, arrived in 1541. The Spanish weren't looking to coexist, they wanted control. Gold and resources motivated them, but so did their belief that they were bringing civilization and Christianity to a land they viewed as wild. To achieve this, they used every tool at their disposal: advanced weapons, horses, and brutal tactics. They founded settlements like Santiago and later Concepcion, staking their claim on territory that had belonged to the Mapuche for generations. For the Mapuche, the Spanish were unlike anything they had faced before. Previous conflicts with neighboring tribes were localized and ended with one side retreating or paying tribute. The Spanish, on the other hand, seemed relentless. They enslaved indigenous people under the encomienda system, forcing them to mine gold or work the land. Resistance was met with violence, often public and horrifying, designed to terrify and suppress. But the Mapuche didn't scare easily. Early attempts by the Spanish to push deeper into their territory were met with fierce opposition. The Mapuche quickly realized they couldn't match the Spanish in open combat, where horses and steel swords dominated. Instead, they turned to guerrilla tactics, striking under the cover of forests and using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their heavily armored enemies. Amid this growing conflict, a young boy named Galvarino came of age. He grew up hearing stories of courage, of Mapuche warriors ambushing Spanish columns, setting fire to outposts, and refusing to kneel. These stories weren't just about the past, they were lessons for the future. Galvarino learned that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about resilience, strategy, and an unshakable belief in the value of freedom. The stage was set for what would become one of the longest and most stubborn resistance movements in the history of colonization. The Mapuche weren't interested in gold or conquest. They fought for something far more personal, the right to live on their own terms. By the mid-1550s, the tension between the Spanish and the Mapuche had boiled over into outright war. The Arauco War wasn't just about land, it was a clash of worldviews. The Spanish saw themselves as conquerors ordained by God, while the Mapuche saw themselves as defenders of their homes, families, and sacred traditions. In 1557, Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza arrived in Chile as the new governor, determined to stamp out the resistance that had embarrassed Spanish efforts for over a decade. Mendoza was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself to the Spanish crown. He led a well-armed expedition deep into Mapuche territory, bringing with him soldiers equipped with steel armor, crossbows, firearms, and horses, tools of war that the Mapuche had never seen before the Spanish invasion. These weapons gave Mendoza's forces confidence, but confidence wasn't enough to navigate the dense forests and unpredictable rivers of southern Chile. The Mapuche turned their knowledge of the land into a powerful advantage, forcing the Spanish into battles where their weapons weren't always effective. One of these battles took place near Lagunillas, a marshy area where the Mapuche had prepared a defensive position. Galvarino, now a seasoned warrior, was among the fighters under the leadership of Caupolicán, one of the most respected Mapuche generals. Caupolicán understood that the Spanish couldn't be defeated in head-on combat, so he relied on ambushes, quick strikes, and an uncanny ability to retreat and regroup before the Spanish could retaliate. When the battle began, the Mapuche fought with everything they had. Galvarino charged alongside his comrades, wielding a spear and shield fashioned from wood and hide. They struck hard, forcing the Spanish into a chaotic melee where firearms were difficult to reload and cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively. For a moment, it seemed like the Mapuche might hold their ground, but the Spanish, trained in European warfare, adapted quickly. Their steel swords cut through wooden shields, and their horses allowed them to chase down Mapuche warriors who tried to retreat. The battle turned into a rout, and the Spanish captured dozens of fighters, including Galvarino. Defeat was hard enough to bear, but the aftermath was even worse. Mendoza, eager to send a message to the Mapuche, ordered that the captured warriors be mutilated. Galvarino and others were brought before him and forced to watch as the Spanish soldiers carried out their gruesome punishment. One by one, the warriors had their hands cut off. When it was Galvarino's turn, he refused to show fear. He looked Mendoza in the eye as his hands were severed at the wrists, his face set in defiance. The pain must have been unbearable, but Galvarino didn't cry out. He knew that any sign of weakness would only embolden the Spanish. Mendoza ordered that the mutilated warriors be released, believing that their injuries would serve as a living warning to the rest of the Mapuche. Galvarino and the others were sent back to their communities bloodied and broken, but Mendoza underestimated the strength of the Mapuche spirit. Far from breaking their will, the sight of Galvarino's mutilation enraged his people. It was a reminder of what was at stake in the fight against the Spanish, their freedom, their land, and their very way of life. Galvarino, though disfigured and in pain, was not defeated. His journey back to his people was the first step in transforming his suffering into a powerful weapon, one the Spanish would never see coming. When Galvarino returned to his people, the sight of his mutilated arms sent a wave of shock and anger through the community. The Spanish had meant for this brutal act to break the Mapuche spirit, but they had miscalculated. The Mapuche, known for their resilience, didn't see a defeated man. They saw a symbol of their enemy's cruelty and their own determination to fight back. For Galvarino, however, the pain wasn't just physical, it was personal. His hands, a vital part of any warrior, had been taken from him, but his spirit remained unbroken. Recovery was slow and grueling. Galvarino couldn't rely on his arms for the most basic tasks, let alone prepare for battle. Yet, even as he struggled to adapt to his new reality, he refused to let despair take hold. Instead, he began to think about how he could fight again. For Galvarino, there was no option other than returning to the battlefield. The Spanish might have taken his hands, but they hadn't taken his will to resist. During this time, Galvarino began to reshape himself, both physically and mentally. He had always been a strong and capable fighter, but now he became something more, a rallying point for his people. Every warrior who looked at him saw the price of Spanish oppression and the lengths to which their enemies would go to crush them. Galvarino didn't shy away from this role. He embraced it. It was then that Galvarino made a decision that would define his legend. He took knives and bound them to the stumps of his arms, turning his mutilation into a weapon. The image was both terrifying and inspiring. Here was a man who refused to be sidelined, who refused to accept defeat. The knives weren't just practical tools for combat, they were a statement. Galvarino would meet the Spanish head-on, and he would fight them with every ounce of strength he had left. This transformation wasn't just about Galvarino himself, it was about what he represented to the Mapuche. His injuries became a reminder of why they fought. The Mapuche were no longer just defending their land, they were avenging the cruelty inflicted upon their families, their friends, and their leaders. Galvarino's presence inspired warriors to fight harder, to hold the line longer, and to refuse surrender under any circumstances. As Galvarino trained himself to fight with his new weapons, his people prepared for another confrontation with the Spanish. The mutilation of their warriors had lit a fire among the Mapuche, and Galvarino became the embodiment of that flame. He stood before his people, knives glinting in the sunlight, and swore to lead them back into battle. His message was clear. The Spanish wanted to take everything from the Mapuche, their land, their freedom, their very identity. But as long as warriors like Galvarino stood to fight, the Spanish would never succeed. The Mapuche were ready to strike back, and Galvarino was determined to lead them. While the Mapuche prepared for their next confrontation, the Spanish waged another war, one against the very identity of the Mapuche people. The conquest of the Americas wasn't just about land and resources, it was also a cultural and spiritual invasion. The Spanish came with a zealous belief that their way of life was superior and that converting indigenous peoples to Christianity was their divine duty. This belief justified in their minds the violence and oppression they inflicted. In Chile, the Spanish implemented the encomienda system, forcing the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples to work in mines and fields under brutal conditions. For many, this was a death sentence. The labor was backbreaking, and the punishments for disobedience were swift and cruel. Families were torn apart, communities were uprooted, and the Mapuche were treated not as people, but as tools for Spanish enrichment. The Spanish also targeted the spiritual core of the Mapuche. Missionaries accompanied soldiers into the region, preaching the gospel and condemning indigenous practices as sinful. Mapuche shamans, who played a vital role in the spiritual and social fabric of their communities, were often labeled as sorcerers or agents of the devil. Many were killed, and sacred rituals were outlawed. The Spanish sought to erase Mapuche beliefs, replacing them with European customs and religion. But the Mapuche weren't passive victims in this cultural assault. While some communities reluctantly converted to Christianity to avoid punishment, many others resisted openly or in secret. Spiritual leaders continued to pass down their knowledge, hiding their practices from Spanish authorities. They knew that their connection to the land, their ancestors, and their traditions was vital to their survival as a people. Public displays of brutality were another tool the Spanish used to instill fear. Mutilations like the one inflicted on Galvarino were part of this strategy. The Spanish believed that these punishments would deter resistance, but more often than not, they had the opposite effect. Each act of violence only deepened the Mapuche's resolve to fight back. They saw the Spanish not as invincible conquerors, but as cruel oppressors who could be outlasted and eventually defeated. This cultural conflict wasn't limited to religion or labor. The Spanish also attempted to impose their language, governance, and social structures on the Mapuche. They introduced new laws and demanded tribute, seeking to reshape the Mapuche into subjects of the Spanish crown. However, the decentralized nature of Mapuche society made this task nearly impossible. Each community resisted in its own way, refusing to relinquish its autonomy. Even as they faced overwhelming odds, the Mapuche found ways to preserve their identity. Their language, Mapudungun, remained a cornerstone of their culture, passed down through generations despite Spanish efforts to suppress it. Their spiritual practices, while driven underground, endured as a source of strength and unity. The Mapuche understood that their survival wasn't just about holding onto land, it was about holding onto who they were. For the Spanish, the Mapuche's resilience was frustrating and unexpected. They had assumed that superior weapons and tactics would bring a swift victory, but they had underestimated the strength of a people fighting not just for survival, but for the preservation of everything they held dear. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. The Arauco War was as much a battle of strategies and terrain as it was of weapons and wills. On paper, the Spanish had every advantage: superior technology, disciplined troops, and experience in organized warfare. But the Mapuche were far from unprepared. They understood that brute force wouldn't win the war, so they adapted, using their land and their knowledge of it as their greatest weapon. The Spanish relied on European military tactics, which emphasized formations, cavalry charges, and coordinated attacks. In open fields or flat terrain, these strategies were devastating. Spanish cavalry could break enemy lines with terrifying speed, and their firearms, while slow to reload, delivered deadly precision at a distance. For the Mapuche, who had never encountered horses or guns before the invasion, these weapons seemed overwhelming at first. But the Spanish struggled in the dense forests, rivers, and hills of Mapuche territory. The terrain neutralized many of their advantages. Horses couldn't maneuver well in thick undergrowth, and firearms were difficult to aim and reload in the chaos of close-quarters combat. The Spanish were forced to move slowly, often on foot, making them vulnerable to ambushes. The Mapuche quickly realized that they couldn't defeat the Spanish in conventional battles. Instead, they turned to guerrilla tactics, striking where the Spanish were weakest. Ambushes became their bread and butter. Warriors would lie in wait along narrow forest paths, attacking Spanish columns with spears and arrows before vanishing into the trees. These sudden strikes left the Spanish frustrated and disoriented, unable to retaliate effectively. The Mapuche also fortified their villages, building defenses in hard-to-reach areas. Hidden fortresses were constructed deep in the forests or on hilltops, making them nearly impossible for the Spanish to assault. These strongholds provided safe havens where Mapuche leaders could regroup and plan their next moves. As the war dragged on, the Mapuche began capturing Spanish weapons and learning how to use them. Firearms and steel swords were added to their arsenal, leveling the playing field. While they couldn't produce these weapons themselves, their ability to repurpose them showed their ingenuity and determination. As we mentioned earlier, the rugged geography of southern Chile became a silent ally to the Mapuche. Rivers created natural barriers, forests provided cover, and mountains offered vantage points. The Spanish found themselves constantly on edge, wary of the land itself as much as the warriors who defended it. The Mapuche knew how to use the terrain to their advantage, drawing the Spanish into traps and forcing them into grueling marches. Even the weather worked against the Spanish. The region's heavy rains turned dirt roads into mud, slowing down troops and supplies. The Arauco War was becoming a test of endurance. The Spanish, with all their firepower and resources, couldn't achieve the quick victory they had expected. The Mapuche, despite their smaller numbers and fewer resources, refused to give up. Their resilience became their greatest strength. For every setback they faced, they found new ways to fight back. At the heart of this struggle was Galvarino. His transformation from a mutilated prisoner to a warrior with knives for hands symbolized the Mapuche's refusal to accept defeat. He represented the ingenuity, courage, and adaptability of his people, qualities that the Spanish underestimated at their peril. As the Mapuche prepared for their next battle, their resolve was stronger than ever. They had learned to adapt, to endure, and to fight on their own terms. And with warriors like Galvarino leading the charge, they were ready to face the Spanish once again. By late 1557, tensions between the Spanish and the Mapuche had reached a boiling point. Governor Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza, emboldened by recent victories and his belief in Spanish superiority, decided to strike at the heart of Mapuche resistance. He planned a decisive campaign to crush the Mapuche once and for all, targeting their leaders and strongholds. The Mapuche, under the leadership of Caupolicán and other prominent warriors, gathered their forces near Mythology. Among them was Galvarino, who had become both a warrior and a symbol of defiance. Armed with the blades he had bound to his wrists, Galvarino inspired his people with his unyielding resolve. The sight of him, scarred, determined, and fearless, reminded the Mapuche what they were fighting for. The Battle of Mythology was one of the largest confrontations between the Mapuche and the Spanish. The Mapuche were well prepared, having fortified their position and set traps throughout the surrounding terrain. Their warriors, armed with spears, slings, bows, and captured Spanish weapons, waited for the inevitable clash. When the Spanish forces arrived, they brought their full arsenal. Soldiers in gleaming armor rode atop powerful horses, while others carried firearms and crossbows. Mendoza believed his disciplined troops and superior firepower would overwhelm the Mapuche, even in this unfamiliar terrain. As the Spanish advanced, they were met with fierce resistance. The Mapuche fought with everything they had, using ambushes and guerrilla tactics to disrupt the Spanish formations. Galvarino led from the front, charging directly into battle. His bladed arms slashed at Spanish soldiers, and his fearless presence emboldened his comrades. To the Spanish, he was a terrifying figure, a man who had turned his mutilation into a weapon and refused to back down. His courage inspired the Mapuche to hold their ground, even as the Spanish pressed forward with relentless force. The battle raged for hours, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Mapuche used every advantage the terrain offered, luring Spanish troops into traps and cutting off their supply lines. Warriors fought hand to hand, their shouts mingling with the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves. The Spanish found themselves bogged down, unable to break the Mapuche's lines as easily as they had in previous battles. Despite their bravery, the Mapuche began to falter under the weight of Spanish firepower. Cavalry charges broke through their defenses, and volleys of musket fire cut down warriors before they could close the distance. The Spanish forces, though battered and bloodied, pushed forward with ruthless determination. Slowly, the tide of battle turned against the Mapuche. Even as the Mapuche forces began to retreat, Galvarino refused to back down. He continued to fight on the front lines, his bladed arms a blur of motion as he struck at the Spanish soldiers who dared approach him. But even Galvarino's unmatched courage couldn't change the outcome. Exhausted and outnumbered, he was eventually captured, along with many others. Brought before Mendoza, Galvarino stood tall, his defiance unshaken. Mendoza, perhaps intrigued by Galvarino's bravery or angered by his continued resistance, demanded that he plead for mercy. Galvarino refused. According to some accounts, he boldly told Mendoza that if he were released, he would return to the battlefield and continue fighting. His words were not those of a man broken by defeat. They were the words of a warrior who had already accepted his fate. Mendoza ordered Galvarino's execution, seeing him as both a threat and an example. The exact details of his death are unclear. Some say he was hanged, others claim he was torn apart. What is certain is that Galvarino met his end with the same courage that had defined his life. He refused to beg, refused to show fear, and refused to give the Spanish the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Galvarino's death marked the end of his personal journey, but not the end of the Mapuche resistance. In fact, his defiance became a cornerstone of the struggle, inspiring future generations to fight back against colonization. While the Spanish had won the Battle of Mythology, they had not won the war. The Arauco War dragged on for centuries, fueled by the resilience and determination of a people who refused to surrender. After the battle, the Spanish sought to consolidate their hold on Mapuche territory. They believed that the death of key leaders like Galvarino and the defeat of Mapuche forces at Mythology would break the back of the resistance. To their frustration, the opposite happened. The loss only deepened the Mapuche's resolve. Capolican continued to lead guerrilla campaigns against the Spanish. Even as the Spanish established more settlements and forts, they struggled to maintain control. Every step into Mapuche territory came with resistance: ambushes on supply lines, attacks on isolated outposts, and night raids on Spanish camps. The Mapuche had turned their land into a battlefield, using their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the Spanish at every turn. The Arauco War evolved into a grueling war of attrition. The Spanish crown poured resources into the conflict, but the return on their investment was limited. Conquering Mapuche territory proved far more challenging than subjugating the centralized Inca Empire to the north. The decentralized nature of Mapuche society meant that even when one leader fell, others rose to take their place. For the Mapuche, resistance wasn't just about military strength, it was about outlasting their oppressors. They understood that time was on their side. As long as they could maintain their cultural identity and their connection to the land, they believed they could weather the storm of colonization. The Arauco War officially ended in the late 19th century, but the Mapuche's struggle for autonomy continued long after that. Even today, the Mapuche remain a proud and resilient people. Their culture, language, and traditions have endured despite centuries of colonization and oppression. Galvarino's life and sacrifice are more than just a chapter in history. They are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He refused to let his injuries define him, instead using them to create a legacy that continues to inspire. The Mapuche people, through their centuries-long resistance, proved that even the most powerful empire could be challenged by a determined and united people. Even decades and centuries after his death, Galvarino's story lives on, reminding us that courage isn't about never falling, it's about rising again, no matter how many times you're knocked down. He fought not just with his hands, but with his heart. And that's why his name will go down as a legend in the pages of history.